In the winter of 1886, a wealthy millionaire lost his two beloved sons in a deadly snowstorm deep in the Colorado mountains. For days, he searched through freezing winds, believing he might never see them again. But when he finally discovered an abandoned cabin hidden beneath the snow, he froze at the unbelievable sight before him. His sons were alive, but the strangers who had rescued them would change his life forever. What happened inside that cabin became a story his family would never forget. Before we begin, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable Old West stories. Now, let's get started. The winter of 1886 had arrived early in the Colorado Territory, covering the mountains in heavy snow and turning every narrow trail into a dangerous white wilderness. Elias Whitmore, a wealthy businessman from Denver, had never feared much in his life. He owned silver mines, large ranches, warehouses, and a magnificent home in the city. Yet none of his fortune could protect him from what happened that terrible evening. Elias was traveling home with his two sons, 12-year-old Thomas and 9-year-old Samuel. Their wagon was loaded with blankets, food, and supplies, and Elias had promised the boys they would reach home before Christmas. But as afternoon faded, dark clouds rolled over the mountains. The wind began to howl. Snow struck the wagon like handfuls of sand. "Father, perhaps we should stop," Thomas said nervously. Elias looked toward the road ahead. "We are close to the valley. We shall make it." He was wrong. Without warning, the horses screamed and reared. The wagon lurched violently, throwing Elias into the snow. One wheel snapped against a buried rock, and the wagon tipped sideways. "Thomas! Samuel!" Elias heard his son shouting, but the storm swallowed their voices. He crawled through the snow, calling their names again and again. When he found the overturned wagon, his heart nearly stopped. The boys were gone. For 2 days, Elias searched through the frozen mountains. His expensive coat became torn, his boots filled with snow, and his hands were covered in cuts. He stopped thinking like a millionaire. He was no longer a powerful businessman. He was simply a father desperate to find his children. On the third morning, he discovered 2 small footprints near a cluster of pine trees. "Thomas," he whispered. He followed them until he saw a broken wooden cabin half buried beneath the snow. A thin trail of smoke rose from its chimney. Elias rushed toward it and pushed open the door. Then he froze. His 2 sons were sitting beside a small fire, wrapped in thick wool blankets. "Father!" Thomas ran into his arms, followed by Samuel, who was crying. Elias held both boys tightly, tears freezing upon his cheeks. But then he noticed the strangers inside. An elderly mountain woman stood beside a cooking pot, while a rugged young rancher named Caleb watched silently from near the fireplace. The woman had saved the boys from freezing to death. Caleb had found them wandering through the storm and carried them to the cabin. Elias stared at his sons, unable to believe they were alive. "My boys," he whispered. "I thought I had lost you forever." Before he could thank them, Caleb suddenly looked toward the window. His expression changed. "The storm is coming back," he said quietly. Elias turned toward the door. Outside, the mountains disappeared beneath another wall of white, and Caleb added, "If we remain here tonight, we may never make it out alive." A millionaire lost his sons in a snowstorm, then froze at the scene before him. The wind began to howl around the little cabin as Caleb secured the wooden door with a heavy iron bar. Snow struck the walls so hard that the entire cabin seemed to tremble. Elias pulled his sons closer. "Are you certain there is another way out?" he asked. Caleb nodded. "There is an old mining station beyond the eastern ridge. It has stone walls and a deep cellar. If we reach it before nightfall, we may survive the storm." The elderly woman shook her head. "The eastern ridge is dangerous." Caleb looked at Elias. "So is staying here." Elias did not hesitate. "Then we go." The journey began before sunrise. Caleb carried Thomas on his back while Elias held Samuel tightly against his chest. The elderly woman followed behind, leaning on a wooden walking stick. Every step was exhausting. Snow reached their knees and icy wind burned their faces. Several times Elias fell, but each time he rose again. For the first time in his life, the wealthy businessman understood how powerless a man could become when nature turned against him. After several hours, Thomas whispered, "Father, are we going to make it?" Elias looked at his son. "We will," he said firmly, though fear filled his heart. At sunset, a dark shape appeared through the snow. The old mining station. Caleb pushed open the frozen door, and everyone hurried inside. There was barely enough wood for a small fire. But Caleb managed to bring the fireplace back to life. The children were wrapped in blankets while the old woman prepared the last of her food. That night, Elias sat beside his sleeping sons. He looked at their pale faces and quietly wept. I thought money could protect them from anything, he admitted. Caleb sat across from him. Money can build walls, he said. But sometimes a man needs people willing to stand beside him when those walls are gone. Elias never forgot those words. By morning, the storm had finally weakened. The survivors returned safely to the valley. Before Caleb could leave, Elias stopped him. You saved my sons. Tell me what you want. Caleb shook his head. Nothing. Elias smiled sadly. Then allow me to give you something you cannot refuse. Months later, Elias returned to the mountains. He purchased the old ranch near the mining station and placed it in Caleb's name. He also built a small school nearby so children from the scattered mountain settlements could receive an education. The elderly woman was given a comfortable home beside the ranch. Elias's sons visited every winter. Thomas eventually became a doctor, while Samuel became a teacher. Neither ever forgot the night Caleb carried them through the snow. Years later, Elias stood outside the same cabin with his grown sons. Snow was falling gently around them. Thomas looked toward the mountains and said, Father, do you ever think about that storm? Elias smiled. Every winter. Samuel asked, Why? Elias looked at the warm light shining from the cabin. Because I entered these mountains thinking I was a rich man who had everything. He paused. But I left knowing the greatest wealth a man can possess is the people who refuse to let him face the darkness alone. And from that winter onward, the ranch remained a refuge for travelers caught in the snow. Whenever a storm covered the mountains, a lantern burned brightly in the window. It became a quiet promise across the Colorado wilderness. No father would have to search those mountains alone again.